The rain began with the sort of modest persistence that Flaxborough residents interpreted as either an inconvenience or a blessing, depending entirely on whether their washing was outside. By mid-afternoon, the pavements gleamed with a thin, steady shine, the gutters murmured contentedly, and the local Methodist chapel, never a place of great drama, acquired an unexpectedly arresting ornament. She appeared just after 3. Mrs. Thimbleby, who was the first to notice her, would later insist that she had been materialized rather than arrived, though she admitted under gentle pressure that she had in fact been rummaging in her shopping bag at the time. Still, when she looked up, there the woman stood, a bride in full regalia, veil and all, motionless beneath the grey, unwavering drizzle. Her gown was not new, its lace slightly yellowed, its hem damp and muddied, but it possessed that unmistakable seriousness of intention that bridal garments carry even in their most forlorn state. She held no bouquet, carried no bag, and stood without any conscious effort to avoid the rain collecting on her sleeves. Instead, she appeared to be watching the road with the focused expectation of one waiting for a very particular arrival. By 3:30, 3 more witnesses had gathered, a retired librarian, a girl from the sweet shop, and a postman with an unfortunate tendency to loiter when confronted with anything the least out of routine. Each maintained a respectful distance, as though the bride were a migratory bird one ought not to disturb too abruptly. At 4, the rain turned heavier. The bride did not retreat into the shelter of the chapel porch. Nor did she acknowledge the timid inquiries of Mrs. Thimbleby, who had approached with all the deference due to a sacred figure or a highly unstable one. When asked whether she needed help, the bride simply shook her head once, politely but decisively, and resumed her silent vigil. By 5, the town had agreed, without any formal committee, that this was a collective matter of delicate concern. A bride waiting alone in the rain, unclaimed, uncollected, and apparently unconcerned, touched upon too many areas of potential scandal to leave unattended, but nobody quite dared to involve the police. At least, not yet. Flaxborough preferred to let its eccentricities simmer before calling in officialdom. At 20 minutes to 6, the drizzle softened, the sky brightened marginally, and Mr. Denzil Wroughton, insurance clerk and amateur moralist, ventured to escort the bride indoors. He approached with the chivalry of someone hoping for both virtue and a good story to tell later. He received neither. For as he reached the chapel gate, the bride suddenly stepped backward, not with fear, but with the weary composure of someone retreating from a misunderstanding. She shook her head once more, raised a damp, gloved hand in apology, and then turned away from him entirely, as though finally convinced that whatever, or whoever she had been waiting for, was not coming. She walked down the pavement, her gown dragging in the runoff from the gutters, and made her way between the dim rows of parked bicycles near the high street. Several observers started after her, but her pace, though unhurried, seemed to dissuade interruption. By the time they reached the corner, she had vanished. No carriage, no car leaving the area, no door heard closing. Only the rain remained. It was the chapel caretaker who found the basket, a small wicker thing, the sort of container that might carry lavender soaps or bottled jam, left on the second step of the porch. Inside it lay 2 items, a folded railway timetable dated 3 years earlier, and half of a black and white photograph, torn cleanly down the middle. It showed a man from the shoulders down, wearing a suit whose lapel bore a tiny metal pin shaped like a bird. A robin, perhaps. The caretaker took these objects to the police station more out of civic duty than alarm, though he argued, quite convincingly, that brides did not usually abandon personal items of any kind, especially not ones involving sharp tears and obsolete timetables. Sergeant Malley accepted the basket with the expression of a man already calculating how many forms would need filling out, and whether this could be classified under miscellaneous fines rather than anything requiring proper pages. Inspector Purbright, summoned from his quiet contemplation of the station's weekly attendance rota, examined the items with mild interest. "The bride herself?" he asked. "Disappeared, sir," Mally replied. "Walked off into the rain like someone who'd remembered she left the oven on." Purbright smiled faintly. People rarely vanish with such practicality. Someone must have seen where she went. "Everyone saw her, sir," Mally said, "but apparently nobody saw her go." Purbright nodded, thoughtfully tapping the torn photograph against his finger. "A bride in the rain," he murmured. "Flaxborough does enjoy the occasional theatrical flourish." His tone contained neither amusement nor concern, merely the sort of quiet curiosity that suggested an inquiry might soon be necessary, not because the situation was dramatic, but because it was peculiar. And in Flaxborough, peculiar often proved to be the most reliable herald of trouble. Purbright placed the half-photo gently back into the basket. "Well then," he said, "let us see who our bride was waiting for, and why they failed to arrive." He paused, glancing again at the tiny robin pinned to the unseen lapel. "And why," he added softly, "they preferred not to be recognized." The drizzle that had accompanied the mysterious bride through the late afternoon persisted into the following morning, though it softened now into a thin, almost polite mist. Flaxborough, accustomed to weather that behaved with more personality than its townsfolk, took little notice. What it did notice, indeed, what it could speak of with tireless enthusiasm, was the bride herself. By 9 o'clock the first substantial retellings were already simmering through the Bluebell Cafe, a place whose modesty of decor was counterbalanced by its generous acoustics for gossip. The cafe smelled of wet umbrellas, burnt toast, and the faintly medicinal tang of Mrs. Mottram's rosehip hand cream, a blend that locals found warmly familiar. Mrs. Thimbleby, the original witness, sat near the window with a cup of tea she had allowed to cool into something resembling dishwater. She was deep in narration, her voice carrying the conviction of someone recounting a spiritual visitation. "I tell you, she stood there as if carved from alabaster, never twitched, never even blinked when the rain washed over her veil. A tragic figure, utterly tragic." Across from her, Mr. Wroughton nodded solemnly, though privately he considered the bride more alarming than tragic. He had approached her with courtesy the previous evening, and the memory of her steady, unblinking gaze still unsettled him. He did not admit this aloud, of course. Flaxborough men preferred their unease dressed in gallantry. "Did she speak at all?" asked Miss Cribbs, who worked part-time at the haberdashery and full-time in the acquisition of conversational leverage. "Only to refuse help," Mrs. Thimbleby replied, in a voice as soft as tissue paper. This poetic phrasing made its way to the next table, where two middle-aged women immediately adjusted it into whisper-thin and then barely human, depending on which version seemed most likely to impress their respective afternoon companions later. Meanwhile, Mr. Whelpdale, local newspaperman and professional embellisher, occupied his usual seat near the counter. He leaned with practiced casualness toward the gossiping cluster, trying to gather fragments with all the delicacy of someone scraping biscuit crumbs from a plate. His notebook sat open, though he pretended he had only laid it there by chance. "Interesting affair, this," he murmured to no one in particular. That was usually enough to draw an audience. A bride appearing from the mist, no carriage, no escort, no explanation. Quite the story, if handled tastefully. Miss Cribbs glanced at the notebook. "You're not going to print anything upsetting, are you? People are sensitive about brides." "My dear Miss Cribbs," Whelpdale replied with injured dignity, "I report facts This assurance would have been more convincing had his column the previous week not described a minor burglary as a midnight rampage of reckless daring. But it was not Whelpdale who introduced the morning's most intriguing twist. That honour belonged to Mrs. Moffat, the stationer's wife, who entered the café at 9:15, carrying a bag of envelopes, a damp umbrella, and a sense of personal significance. "I've seen her before," she declared, before even ordering her tea. The café froze in the way small gatherings freeze, quietly, with every ear sharpening slightly. Mrs. Thimbleby looked affronted. "You cannot have. She had a most particular presence." "I saw her," Mrs. Moffat insisted, 3 days ago near the railway station. Not in a wedding dress, naturally, but I remember her face. She asked about trains to Grantham." Mr. Wroughton frowned. "Trains to Grantham? But the timetable found in that basket was 3 years old." "Yes, well," Mrs. Moffat said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "I got the impression she'd misplaced something important." This small revelation rippled through the room like a hot kettle hissing onto cool tiles. Uncertainty expanded, imagination followed. Some believed immediately that the bride had been jilted. Others concluded she had been searching for a lost fiancé who had disappeared by train years earlier. A few, those most inclined toward theatrical speculation, whispered that she might have been a runaway from some clandestine institution. Miss Cribbs considered this too delicious to dismiss. The swirl of rumours grew so dense that the café seemed to hum with them, like a hive, irritated but industrious. And yet, for all the noise, there was something curiously absent, a witness who had seen the bride after she walked away. "That's what troubles me," Mr. Wroughton finally said, stirring his tea with the sort of long circular motion associated with deep thought. "A woman in that gown cannot simply disappear. Someone must have opened a door for her." Mrs. Mottram, polishing a row of teaspoons, offered her own theory in the tone of someone accustomed to practical explanations. "She probably ducked into a car," she said. "People always see less than they think they do in rain, especially if they expect a bride to be where brides ought to be." This would have been a sensible remark if any witness had mentioned a vehicle, but it was the next comment that reached Inspector Purbright. For at 10 o'clock, young Arnold Pitts, the baker's apprentice and unofficial courier of half-baked truths, arrived breathlessly at the police station to deliver what he called vital intelligence. His eyes gleamed with the joy of someone bringing treasure. "Sir," he told Sergeant Malley, "the bride got in a green Morris Minor. I heard it straight from Mrs. Moffat herself." "Mrs. Moffat?" Malley repeated, sceptical. "She told the café she saw the woman days ago, not last night." Arnold puffed up. "She said both, apparently, or maybe it was Miss Cribbs. But someone in the café saw something important." Malley sighed, which was his customary response to youth, gossip, and the mention of Miss Cribbs in any investigative context. Still Purbright, who happened to be passing the desk, paused. "A green Morris Minor?" he asked mildly. "That's what they're saying at the Bluebell, sir," Arnold replied. "And Mrs. Moffat says the bride had been asking about trains." Purbright regarded him with polite curiosity, as though Arnold were a specimen of unusual plumage. "Ah, and the rumours are organising themselves," the inspector said. "A stage in the process. They will settle eventually. But let us see what shape they take first." He retrieved his coat from the hook, a gesture so unhurried that Arnold briefly wondered if the inspector had misunderstood the urgency. Purbright understood it perfectly. For while Flaxborough's rumours rarely aligned cleanly with fact, they did possess a peculiar talent. When numerous enough, they tended to circle a truth they could not yet articulate. and the inspector, calm as ever, intended to see what truth they were circling now. He nodded once to Mally. "Let us begin at the cafe," he said, "before the story grows legs longer than the bride's gown." And with that, he stepped into the damp, brightening morning, toward the Bluebell Cafe, toward the churning pool of speculation, and toward whatever fragile thread of truth lay beneath it all. Inspector Purbright entered the Bluebell Cafe with the unobtrusive calm of a man accustomed to arriving just after the excitement had peaked. The room, still swollen with the perfume of speculation, quieted only slightly as he stepped inside. Regulars attempted to appear naturally occupied, stirring cups already well stirred, skimming newspapers they had read 30 minutes prior. Yet every eye tugged toward him with eager restraint. Nothing pleased Flaxborough more than contributing to a police inquiry, provided their contribution required no real effort and potentially led to someone else's embarrassment. Purbright greeted Mrs. Mottram with a polite nod, then surveyed the room with deliberate mildness. Mrs. Thimbleby, vibrating with self-importance, raised her hand halfway, unsure whether she should wait to be summoned like an auction item or volunteer herself boldly. He spared her the decision. "Good morning, Mrs. Thimbleby," he said. "I understand you were among the first to see the lady in question yesterday." She brightened. "Inspector, I was indeed. A most haunting spectacle. I can't say I've ever seen anything like it outside of a matinee performance." "I hope it wasn't quite as dramatic," he murmured, "but your observations would help." She began recounting the scene with great flourishes, though Purbright, who had interviewed her on multiple occasions, knew to listen more for the omissions than the embellishments. He waited patiently while she described the bride as ethereal, otherworldly, and possibly continentally distressed, which seemed an oddly geographical form of emotional turmoil. "When you spoke to her?" Purbright asked gently. "Did she hesitate before answering?" Mrs. Thimbleby considered this. "No, Inspector," she responded immediately, as if she had prepared the refusal beforehand. "A rehearsed politeness," Purbright repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting." He thanked her and turned next to Mr. Wroughton, who insisted on giving a minute-by-minute account of his approach, the awkward bow he made, unsolicited, and the bride's subtle retreat. "She wasn't startled, Inspector," he said. "More disappointed, as though I were not the person she had hoped to see. Or," Purbright suggested, "not the person she had been instructed to meet." Wroughton blinked. "Instructed, sir?" "It is a possibility," the inspector said mildly, though his tone offered no explanation. He moved from witness to witness with the same unhurried poise, gathering their tales as though collecting fallen petals from a wind-swept garden, knowing full well that each was altered by the breeze that carried it. Nothing he heard aligned fully with anything else, yet each account carried a small, consistent thread. The bride had been waiting with purpose, not confusion. The final conversation was with Mrs. Moffat, who had begun to regret ever stepping into the cafe that morning. Her earlier confidence had dissolved under the weight of communal scrutiny. "Inspector, I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said, twisting her handkerchief. "I only said she looked familiar." "And that is useful," Purbright assured her gently. "Tell me again where you believe you saw her." "At the station, sir. She was standing near the ticket window looking terribly anxious. Not distressed, simply watchful, as though she were hoping someone might appear from the platform." "And she asked you about trains to Grantham?" "Yes. She asked which days they came through at 2:30. I told her they came daily." "Did she seem reassured?" Mrs. Moffat shook her head. "Quite the opposite." She looked as though my answer confirmed something she feared. A quiet moment passed. The cafe murmurs faded into a soft background hum, the kind that formed naturally whenever Flaxborough's attention narrowed to a single point. Purbright folded his hands behind his back. Did she mention anyone by name? No, Inspector, nothing of the sort. And her clothing, then? It was ordinary? Mrs. Moffat nodded quickly. Oh, plain skirt, dark coat, a scarf, nothing bridal. Purbright noted the detail with care. The bride had appeared in a wedding dress only on the day she stood waiting in the rain. If her visit to the station had taken place 3 days earlier, then the gown had not been a spontaneous romantic folly. It had been chosen, worn with intention, perhaps with fear. When he stepped outside into the now drying morning, the inspector paused beneath the cafe's striped awning, letting the cool air steady the noise of the cafe behind him. The street looked ordinary enough, a church spire peeking over rooftops, a grocer unloading crates of apples, the damp smell of morning paper ink rising from doorsteps. Yet somewhere among these familiar patterns lay the truth that would tug the mystery into alignment. He proceeded to the florist's shop next, prompted by a remark from the cafe. Someone had mentioned the bride holding an unusual bouquet, though most insisted she held nothing at all. The florist, a neat woman named Mrs. Ullswater, had sharp eyes and an even sharper memory. She didn't buy from me, she said after hearing his question, but I saw her through the window yesterday. She had an arrangement in her hands, quite strange, yellow freesia mixed with white heather and a single red carnation, not a combination any bride would choose, not unless she was making a statement. What sort of statement? Purbright asked. A personal one, Mrs. Ullswater replied. Flowers have meanings, Inspector, though most men never learn them. Purbright smiled faintly. You may find I am willing to listen. She leaned forward, delighted to demonstrate her expertise. Freesia for trust, she said. Heather for protection, red carnation for a broken bond, a peculiar bouquet for a wedding, but a perfect one if the bride was signalling something to whoever she expected to meet. A warning, perhaps? Purbright asked quietly. Or a plea, she answered. Either way, it was not a joyful arrangement. He thanked her, then spent the next 20 minutes walking the length of the high street, replaying each recollection with the patient discipline of a man sifting sand for flecks of truth. The bride had visited the station days before. She had asked about trains. She had waited with purpose. She had carried a bouquet no one had sold her. And she had vanished without a trace. The torn photograph in the basket pressed itself into his thoughts. Someone had arranged the scene. Someone had instructed her, or frightened her, into standing in the rain wearing a wedding dress, waiting for a meeting that never came. It was only when he returned to the station, retracing the bride's earlier steps, that he noticed an overlooked detail. Near the platform gates, taped to a notice board, was a faded charity poster from last year's council fete. The photograph showed several councillors smiling painfully in front of a lemon cake competition. One of them, Councillor Harbert, wore a lapel pin shaped unmistakably like a robin. Purbright regarded the image for a quiet, thoughtful moment, then stepped away without touching it. He had learned long ago that truths revealed too quickly tended to draw the wrong attention. For now, the robin could remain perched on Harbert's lapel. Purbright would wait to see who else noticed it. Councillor Ephraim Harbert arrived at the police station precisely at 2 o'clock, a fact he ensured everyone noticed by consulting his pocket watch twice before crossing the threshold. He wore the expression of a man presenting himself for applause rather than inquiry, and he greeted the front desk with a solemnity more suited to unveiling a memorial plaque. Sergeant Malley, startled from a quiet attempt to reorganize his blotter, rose with instinctive politeness. "Good afternoon, Councillor." "Sergeant," Harbert said, lowering his voice theatrically, "I have come to render what assistance I can in this unfortunate business with the bride." Malley blinked. "Unfortunate, sir?" Yes, quite distressing for a community such as ours. Rumours of abandoned brides create atmospheres." He gestured vaguely, as though fending off invisible vapours. "We must ensure the matter is properly addressed." Purbright, hearing the commotion, stepped from his office with an unhurried calm that often unsettled people more than any interrogation. "Councillor Harbert," he said pleasantly, "this is generous of you." "Inspector," Harbert replied, bowing his head with the solemn dignity of someone blessing crops. "I feared you might overlook a crucial angle, a dangerous angle, one involving Mr. George Tranter." He paused for effect, expecting shock or at least a raised eyebrow. Purbright offered neither. "Mr. Tranter?" the inspector repeated in a mild tone. "The signalman?" "Yes, just so. A solitary figure. Lives alone. Keeps peculiar hours. He is, if I may put it delicately, a man of unusual dispositions." "Such as?" Purbright asked. Harbert cleared his throat. "An attachment to women in distress." "Documented?" Purbright asked, knowing the answer. "Observed," Harbert insisted, though his shifting eyes betrayed a lack of reliable witnesses. Purbright motioned gently toward his office. "Perhaps you'll sit, Councillor?" Harbert entered the room with the solemn importance of someone about to disclose a government secret. Once seated, he crossed his legs and folded his hands, settling into a posture that suggested he expected to be thanked by the Home Office at any moment. "Inspector," he began, "I believe Mr. Tranter was seen near the chapel shortly before the bride appeared." Purbright nodded slightly. "By whom?" "A reputable citizen," Harbert said. "Which one?" Purbright asked. "A discreet one." Purbright smiled faintly. "I see, and this discreet witness, did they mention whether Mr. Tranter spoke to the bride?" Harbert hesitated, then straightened. "That is not known, but the man's presence at all raises questions." "It raises one," Purbright said. "Why would a railway signalman abandon his post on a damp afternoon to linger near the Methodist chapel?" "Exactly," Harbert declared. "No respectable man would wander there without reason." "There are many respectable men who do," Purbright murmured. "Funerals, christenings, temperance meetings." Harbert flushed faintly at the mention of temperance. His fondness for brandy was no secret. "I merely offer the information," he said, stiffly. "It is your duty to assess it." "Indeed," Purbright replied. "And I shall also need to speak with Mr. Tranter." Harbert looked unexpectedly pleased. Good, the matter will be cleared quickly then." But Purbright, studying the councillor's self-satisfied posture, recognized something deeper. Harbert was not merely eager to assist, he was eager to steer. And those who attempted to steer police inquiries usually did so for reasons as personal as they were inconvenient. "Councillor," Purbright said lightly, "do you recall the charity fete last year, the one with the lemon cakes?" Harbert blinked. "Yes, of course." "And you wore a lapel pin that afternoon, a robin, I believe?" Harbert's fingers twitched unconsciously toward the left side of his jacket. "Ah, yes, a little trinket gifted by my niece." "Very charming," Purbright said. "Do you still have it?" The councillor stiffened. "Somewhere, I imagine. Why?" Purbright offered a gentle smile that could have meant anything at all. "Only curiosity." Harbert swallowed, then rose with the air of someone abruptly concluding a meeting. "Well then, Inspector, I trust my information will be of service." He left, pausing only to nod to Mally with the dignity of a duke acknowledging a footman. When he was gone, Mally ventured, "Do you really think Tranter's got anything to do with this, sir?" "Possibly," Purbright said, "but I suspect Councillor Harbert would be very pleased if we believed so." "Which means," Mally said slowly, "you don't." "I believe in information," Purbright said, "not in enthusiasm." He retrieved his coat again, for the day showed no sign of granting him desk time. The railway signal box sat a short walk from the main line, perched like a stubborn wooden bird overlooking the tracks. When Purbright climbed the narrow steps, he found Mr. George Tranter in his small kingdom of levers, gauges, and a kettle that appeared older than he was. "Afternoon, Inspector," Tranter said with a cautious politeness. "If it's about the delays this morning, we had a faulty point. Sorted now." "I'm here about yesterday," Purbright said. "The bride at the chapel." Tranter froze for a fraction of a second, so slight it might have been no more than the kettle's whistle stuttering against the lid. "Bride?" he echoed. "Didn't see any bride." "You weren't near the chapel yesterday afternoon?" "No, Inspector, I was on duty." "All day?" "Most of it. Had a break at 2:30, but I stayed in. Rain was coming sideways. Didn't fancy a soaking." Purbright watched him carefully. Tranter's face was weathered, his eyes steady. He did not seem to be hiding fear, only confusion at why anyone would expect him to know more. "Councillor Harbert believes you were in the area," Purbright said. Tranter snorted. "Harbert believes a lot of things, mostly about himself." "You know him well?" "Well enough to avoid him when he's sniffing around the railway, asking questions about people's comings and goings. Likes to look important. Never pays for tea." Purbright considered this with mild amusement. "You didn't see the woman before yesterday, then? At the station, perhaps?" "No, sir." "And if she'd been here in that dress, I'd remember." Purbright paused. "She wasn't in the dress then. Ordinary coat. Scarf." Tranter thought for a long moment. "Might have seen someone like that last week. Took a long look at the Grantham timetable. Didn't buy a ticket." "Did she speak to you?" "No, just looked nervous. People look nervous at stations. Doesn't mean much." Purbright thanked him and descended the steps. He felt no tremor of guilt in Tranter's manner, only the weary calm of a man used to late trains and early suspicion. Back on the high street, Purbright paused again beneath the fading afternoon light. The pieces were reorganizing themselves quietly. Harbert too eager, Tranter indifferent, the bride deliberate, the bouquet symbolic, the torn photograph unmistakable. Someone had tried to present a tidy narrative to the town. Someone hoped the police would follow the route laid out. Purbright had no intention of doing so. He turned toward the station once more, his gaze drifting to the poster with Harbert's robin pin. The councillor had attempted to place Tranter neatly into the centre of suspicion, which suggested that whatever Harbert feared, it lived uncomfortably close to himself. And Purbright, walking with the same steady patience that guided all his enquiries, understood that the next thread would reveal itself soon, because people who meddled with appearances invariably made mistakes. He only needed to wait for Harbert's. Inspector Purbright did not immediately return to the station after leaving the signal box. Instead, he walked the length of the narrow road that skirted the railway yard, letting the afternoon light settle into its familiar, pale gold hush. The town lay in that brief interval between bustle and quiet, when shopkeepers counted tills behind locked doors and housewives contemplated the possibility of tea before committing fully to it. It was a gentle hour, one that rarely invited drama. And yet it was precisely in such hours that Purbright found the most revealing truths. His thoughts circled back, not to Harbert's attempt at direction, nor to Tranter's weary indifference, but to the small woven basket that still waited on his desk. more specifically, to the torn photograph inside it. The image had remained a silent presence through all the morning's gossip, each witness's recollection somehow avoiding direct mention of it. As though the physical clue were too stark, too deliberate, too unlike the town's preferred mysteries, which thrived best on hearsay rather than hard objects. The robin lapel pin, that was the detail that returned to him again and again. It was curious how such a trivial ornament could insist upon itself. He retraced his steps toward the police station, the clatter of distant rail joints echoing faintly behind him. When he reached his office, he closed the door gently and sat before the basket. The torn photograph was exactly as he remembered. The shoulder of a man in a well-worn suit, the small bird-shaped pin glinting faintly in the black and white print, its beak angled upward as if in mid-song. The tear was clean, too clean, he thought now. Someone had ripped the photograph with care, ensuring the half that remained revealed only what they intended. Purbright lifted it toward the window, letting the fading light sharpen its edges. A man who wore such a pin would likely wear it habitually. People who found comfort in minor adornments rarely allowed them to rest in drawers, and Councillor Harbert, whose vanity was as predictable as his punctuality, was precisely the type to choose a distinctive accessory and consider it a hallmark of character. But there was something else, a detail so quiet he had nearly ignored it. On the visible lapel in the photograph, just beneath the robin, there was a faint irregularity, like a frayed thread or a loose stitch. Purbright narrowed his eyes. He had seen something similar before, though not often. Tailors used certain stitches to repair small moth nibbles discreetly. The thread visible here was just slightly lighter than the surrounding wool. He lowered the photograph and reached for the station telephone. "Mally," he said, when the sergeant answered. "Would you mind checking the lost and found cupboard? Look for any clothing items recently deposited, especially men's jackets." Mally's puzzled silence lasted long enough for Purbright to imagine him rotating slowly toward the cupboard with the fatalism of a man expecting collapse. After a few minutes, Mally returned to the line. "We've one jacket turned in last week," he reported. "Found on the number 7 bus. Brown wool, bit worn, no identification." "Any repairs on the lapel?" A rustle of cloth came through the receiver. "Yes, sir. Little patch stitch near the buttonhole. Keep it aside for me." Purbright hung up, though even as he did so, he doubted the jacket would offer more than confirmation of a thread he already followed. Still, confirmations were valuable. Outside, the afternoon dulled into a pale grey, the kind of sky that made the town appear gently washed. Purbright left the station again, the photograph tucked into an inner pocket. He crossed the high street, its puddles settling into stillness, and headed toward the side lane where Flaxborough's smaller shops and service businesses clustered like shy siblings beside their bolder commercial relatives. He turned into the small photography shop, Bentley and Son, which now belonged solely to the son, as Mr. Bentley Sr. had departed both the business and the world several years earlier. The younger Mr. Bentley was a thin, eager man whose enthusiasm always exceeded his competence by a measurable margin. "Inspector Purbright," he exclaimed when the bell tinkled above the door. "Looking for something in particular?" "Possibly," Purbright replied. "I wondered if you might recognize something." He produced the torn photograph and placed it on the counter. Bentley leaned forward with the solemnity of a man examining an archaeological relic. "Old print," he said. "Early 50s, I'd say." "Taken with a folding camera. See the border thickness here?" Purbright nodded. "And the subject?" Bentley squinted. "Hard to say without the face, but the suit is well made. Local tailor, most likely. That lapel pin is distinctive." "It is," Purbright agreed. Do you remember seeing anyone photographed recently with similar attire? Bentley's eyes brightened. Actually, yes. Councillor Harbert came in some months back for a portrait. He insisted the lighting make him look civic yet approachable. Bentley mimicked the phrase and tone precisely. He wore a robin pin then. Does he wear it often? Oh yes, said it was symbolic. Bentley lowered his voice. Of what he didn't specify. Purbright thanked him and stepped back into the street, the faint scent of photographic chemicals clinging to his coat. If the robin pin were indeed Harbert's preferred ornament, then the likelihood of it appearing coincidentally in the torn photograph was slim. He had no intention, however, of assuming anything solely because it was convenient. The next stop was the town library, where Miss Clitheroe presided over the reading rooms with the unassailable authority of a general in tweed. She spared Purbright a look that conveyed both respect and irritation. She disliked unscheduled interruptions. "What is it this time?" she asked, lowering her spectacles. "A small favour," Purbright said. "Do you keep newspaper archives from the last few years?" "You know very well we do," she said, "though I doubt many people use them." "I wonder if you might recall any council events where group photographs were taken, preferably indoors." Miss Clitheroe's eyebrow arched. "I do recall a charity luncheon. There was a photographer present." "Something about a cake competition." Purbright nodded. "Yes, the same photograph displayed at the station." Miss Clitheroe rose with brisk efficiency, leading him to a drawer of meticulously organized folders. She selected one marked Civic Events, MISC, and produced several photographs. In each, Councillor Harbert stood prominently, sometimes smiling stiffly, sometimes gesturing at pastries with the dignity of a statesman endorsing foreign policy. And in every single image the robin pin gleamed on his lapel. Purbright studied the photographs carefully, memorizing the lapel line, the stitch, the angle of the pin. The resemblance was unmistakable, yet he resisted the conclusion that a man's fondness for a bird-shaped accessory connected him directly to a woman standing alone in a rain-soaked wedding gown. The world rarely offered such convenient lines, and Flaxborough almost never did. Still, something had been staged. The torn photograph had been placed with intent, and the one detail preserved in the half-image, the robin, was the detail most connected to Harbert. When Purbright left the library, evening had begun its slow descent, drawing soft shadows across the cobbles. Lamps flickered to life, their glow falling gently over the street. The inspector walked back toward the station, his steps measured, his thoughts aligning piece by piece. He returned to his desk, set the photograph beside the basket, and finally allowed himself the beginning of a theory, not a full explanation, but a shape forming behind a curtain. Someone had wanted a story told, a particular story, one involving a bride, a meeting, a disappearance, and a hint toward a certain respectable councillor. But was the hint meant to implicate him, or was it meant to hide someone else entirely by attracting attention to him? Purbright leaned back, eyes half-lidded. The odd detail, the robin, was not just a clue, it was an instruction, like a signpost placed on a path that led nowhere useful. Someone had offered him a carefully chosen piece of evidence, expecting him to follow it obediently. Purbright rarely did what was expected, and when he extinguished the desk lamp, leaving only the faint evening light upon the torn photograph, the small bird seemed to watch him, its metal beak frozen in a silent, permanent warning. The following morning arrived with a crispness that suggested the weather had finally grown tired of indecision. The clouds dispersed into pale tatters above the rooftops, giving Flaxborough a clarity it seldom wore. Under such light, the town's imperfections, cracked paving stones, half-flaked shop fronts, the persistent lean of the postbox near the chemist, stood out with almost artistic stubbornness. Yet for Purbright, the clarity only served as a reminder that appearances often concealed far more than they revealed. He walked to the station earlier than usual, the single torn photograph resting once more in his pocket. The robin pin glinted faintly each time he touched it through the fabric, as though reminding him of its presence. But today he intended to broaden the scope of the inquiry. Harbert may have been eager to point toward Tranter, but the town, in its quiet, winding manner, held more characters capable of mischief than any councilman cared to admit. Sergeant Malley greeted him with a mug of lukewarm tea and a stack of reports that appeared both unnecessary and unavoidable. "Morning, sir. More statements about the bride." "Any of them useful?" Purbright asked. "Not especially," Malley said. Though Mrs. Crampton, from the boarding house, insisted the bride was radiating reluctance. "I'm not sure what she meant." Purbright smiled faintly. Mrs. Crampton's vocabulary often exceeds her comprehension. He scanned the other reports, small, inconsistent accounts that wove around the central mystery without touching it. But one caught his attention, a note scribbled at the bottom of a form, made at Wetherill boarding house, says bride looked relieved, not upset. This contradicted nearly every witness's description. Relief was a curious emotion for a bride standing alone in the rain. He tucked the note into his pocket and set off toward Wetherill boarding house, a drab 3-story building whose gutters perpetually overflowed regardless of weather, as though protesting the indignity of habitation. Mrs. Crampton, the landlady, met him at the door with the brisk severity of someone who believed moral decay lived in every uninspected suitcase. "Inspector Purbright, I've scrubbed the steps, so please mind your feet." "I shall do my best," he said. "I understand your maid had some observations about the woman seen yesterday." Mrs. Crampton sniffed. "Lily talks too much for her own good. Come along." She ushered him into the narrow hallway where the wallpaper sagged in defeat and the air smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. Lily emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands onto an apron already covered in it. She was young, pale, and possessed that earnest eagerness to please which made her an unreliable witness but an excellent source of accidental truths. "Inspector," she said, dipping her head, "I didn't mean to cause a stir." "Only clarity," Purbright corrected softly. "Tell me again what you saw." "Well, I was fetching coal from the yard and I saw her from the corner of the lane. The bride, I mean. She was standing still as anything, but, well, she didn't look sad. People say she was abandoned, but she looked almost relieved, like someone who'd expected worse." "What worse?" Mrs. Crampton demanded sharply. "I don't know," Lily squeaked. "Only that she wasn't crying. She was steady." Purbright regarded the girl carefully. She had no talent for deception. Her sincerity lay untouched by embellishment. "And she wasn't alone," Lily added suddenly. Mrs. Crampton gasped. "Lily!" "I didn't mean it like that," Lily stammered. "Just, there was someone watching her from the corner, a man. I didn't see his face. He ducked behind a cart when I looked straight at him." Purbright leaned forward slightly. "What sort of cart?" "A greengrocer's, sir. Mr. Pottle's, I think. Big canvas cover at the back." "Did the man seem familiar?" "No, sir, but he wasn't the groom. She didn't look frightened of him. More like she expected him to be there." Mrs. Crampton folded her arms, deeply offended by the idea of anything occurring near her, property without her explicit permission. Purbright thanked them both and returned outside, allowing himself a moment to let the new thread settle. A watcher, a bride relieved rather than distressed, a dress worn for a message, not a ceremony. The circle widened, His next call was the home of Mr. Lembury, a disgraced former choirmaster whose peculiar habits had once made him an unintentional source of entertainment for Flaxborough's gossips. Lembury lived in a small cottage permanently scented with damp hymnals. He opened the door with the expression of a man resigned to being suspected of things. "Inspector," he sighed, "if this is about the missing collection tin from Harvest Sunday, I swear I put it exactly—" "It isn't," Purbright said gently. "I'm following up on an unusual sighting yesterday. Did you see a woman in a wedding dress near the chapel?" Lembury blinked. "Ah, the apparition. You saw her then?" "Saw her?" "Inspector, she startled the life out of me. I'd been retrieving my violin case from the vestry when I looked out and saw her standing there in the rain like a bride who'd just realized something dreadful." "What sort of dreadful?" Lembury hesitated. "Not heartbreak, more recognition." Purbright tilted his head. "Of someone she knew, perhaps, or someone she hoped she wouldn't see." This echo of Lily's suggestion added a subtle but significant weight. Before leaving, Purbright paused. "You notice details others miss. It's in the nature of your work. Did anything seem deliberate about her posture?" "Oh, yes," Lembury said earnestly. "She wasn't lost. She was waiting in the exact way a person does when time is important." Another thread confirmed. Still, Purbright felt the need to pursue one more lead. The landlady whose tenants changed with the frequency of seasonal sales. Mrs. Gubbins, who ran a boarding house near the river, was a woman whose opinions could be extracted only by patience and the strategic application of compliments. When Purbright arrived, she was kneeling in her garden, pruning rose bushes with the determination of someone negotiating personal grievances with thorns. "Mrs. Gubbins," he greeted. She grunted. "If you're here about the noise complaint, tell Mr. Stokes to learn the difference between footsteps and burglary." "Not today," Purbright said. "I wondered whether any of your tenants mentioned a woman matching the description of our rain-soaked bride." Mrs. Gubbins paused mid-snip. "Now that you mention it, one of the new girls said she'd seen someone matching that description staying in the spare room over the bakery last week. Didn't say much, kept to herself." Purbright felt a quiet shift, the sensation of a puzzle bending toward coherence. "And the girl, did she mention where this woman went?" "No, just that she left suddenly. No luggage except a small case." The ski inspector walked back toward the high street, his footsteps steady, the morning now humming with purposeful movement. The more he gathered, the more obvious something became. The bride had been woven through multiple corners of Flaxborough for days before her dramatic appearance. Quietly, cautiously. She had not been abandoned, she had been hiding. But from whom? He returned to his office and placed the basket, its timetable, its torn photograph, before him once more. The robin stared back, its tiny metal shape frozen in mid-perch. Someone had staged the scene at the chapel. Not to reveal the truth, but to signal it, or conceal it, or control it. The bride's appearance, the bouquet choices, the timing, the rain, it all bore the shape of something rehearsed, planned, instructed. But the mistakes, the watcher behind the cart, the nervous visit to the station, the torn photograph, those were human. Those were the places where truth leaked. And Purbright knew that the next development would not come from the bride, nor from Harbert, nor from any of the witnesses trying to appear helpful. It would come from someone else entirely, someone whose secrets had not yet brushed against the mystery, but soon would. He leaned back in his chair as the afternoon light dimmed, the robin's metal eye glinting faintly in the room. The town was revealing more of its characters, and one of them, quiet and unnoticed, had already made a mistake big enough to change the direction of the entire inquiry. Inspector Purbright was not a man prone to expecting revelations at convenient times, yet the following morning delivered one with almost theatrical punctuality. It arrived in the form of a breathless railway porter named Simon Todge, who burst through the station entrance with the urgency of a man escaping a dramatic fire rather than reporting a quiet discovery. "Inspector, sir, you'd best come quick," he panted, clutching his cap in both hands as though it were the only thing preventing him from flying apart. "Down by the parcel store. It's something." Purbright lifted an eyebrow. Simon Todge was known for exaggeration, but the trembling earnestness in his voice suggested this time he was genuinely unsettled. "Lead the way," Purbright said, slipping his coat on. They made their way down the narrow corridor that ran beside the station platforms. The morning's trains had already departed, and the air carried the faint residual warmth of coal smoke mixed with the cold cleanliness of the platform tiles. Todge stopped abruptly near the parcel alcove, gesturing toward a small crate placed against the wall. Except it wasn't a crate, it was a wicker basket, just like the first. For a long moment the inspector said nothing. The basket sat innocently on the floor, its woven handle curved neatly upward, its lid secured with a short length of string. Nothing about it suggested danger, yet its mere existence felt like a deliberate echo, a pointed reminder from someone unseen. "I didn't touch it," Todge said, swallowing hard. "Didn't dare." Purbright knelt beside the basket. The weave was precisely the same style as the one found at the chapel, though this one looked slightly newer, less weather-worn. He loosened the string and lifted the lid. Inside lay a neatly folded handkerchief, white linen, its corner stained a rusty brown that could only be dried blood. Beneath it, wrapped in brown paper, was a small, flat object. Purbright unfolded the paper. The other half of the photograph. He held the pieces side by side, aligning the torn edges. Together they formed the full figure of the man, tall, well-dressed, standing stiffly before some indistinct background. His face now visible, blandly handsome, neither familiar nor striking, but the robin-shaped pin gleamed sharply on his lapel. Someone wanted the inspector to see the man clearly. Someone wanted this picture completed, but why reveal the second half only now? And why leave it here, where it would be found by a station employee within minutes? "This wasn't dropped," Purbright murmured. "It was placed." Todge leaned forward timidly. "Sir?" "Someone staged this deliberately," the inspector replied. "The timing is too tidy, the location too obvious." A train whistle sounded faintly in the distance, and Purbright straightened slowly. He returned the items to the basket and carried it with him as he and Todge walked back toward the office. Mally met them at the door, his eyes widening at the sight of the new basket. "Sir? Another one?" "Indeed," Purbright said calmly. "Found moments ago." Mally examined the contents, his expression tightening. "Blood, sir, and the rest of the photograph." "Yes," Purbright said, "though I suspect the blood is merely for effect." "You think it's staged?" "Staged but hurried," Purbright replied. The handkerchief was folded carelessly. The knot on the string was tied left-handed. Someone nervous or pressed for time. He placed the basket next to the first on his desk. The two sat like bookends to a mystery that seemed to be arranging itself piece by piece, as though the culprit were both controlling the narrative and losing control of it simultaneously. Mally folded his arms. "Sir, do you think the man in the picture is the bride's missing groom?" Purbright considered this. "Possibly, but more likely he is the person behind her distress, or the one she hoped to avoid." He tapped the robin pin gently with the tip of his finger. This little bird was meant to lead us. And I'm beginning to wonder not only who placed it where we'd find it, but who it was meant to implicate. Mally frowned. "Harbert?" "Perhaps," Purbright said, "but perhaps not." A soft knock interrupted them. A timid station clerk stepped inside. "Inspector, something else has come in. A man at the ticket booth said he saw a woman matching the bride's description late last night, wearing ordinary clothes, heading toward the river road." Purbright turned sharply. "Did she appear distressed?" "More hurried, sir, as if she didn't want anyone noticing her." "And the man who saw her? Does he know where she went?" "No, sir. She turned down the old tow path." Purbright nodded slowly, absorbing the detail. A towpath at night was a place chosen only by those who wished to be unseen, or by those meeting someone they dared not be observed with. "Thank him," Purbright said, "and ask him to return if he recalls anything else." The clerk nodded and hurried away. Purbright stood still for a long moment. The narrative had shifted. The bride had not simply vanished. She had moved with intention, discarding her dress and blending back into the town in plain clothing, which meant she was still near, still watching, still afraid. He looked again at the blood-stained handkerchief. It was too small a patch to imply injury. It was theatre, a prompt. Someone wanted the police worried about violence where none had yet occurred. Someone wanted the story to follow a certain path. He put on his coat again. "Sir?" Mally asked. "Let's visit the river," Purbright said. "I believe our missing bride left more behind than footprints." The towpath, narrow and lined with weeds, stretched along the slow-moving river like a quiet reminder of older, simpler days. The water reflected the pale morning light with deceptive stillness, broken only by the occasional ripple from a drifting leaf. Purbright walked the path with careful eyes. Halfway along, a patch of disturbed mud caught his attention. Kneeling, he examined the surface. A footprint, small, narrow, a woman's shoe, and beside it something pressed lightly into the dirt. Purbright picked it up gently between thumb and forefinger, a single freesia petal, faintly bruised, pale yellow. The same flower at the center of the bride's strange bouquet. She had been here recently. Purbright turned the petal in his palm. Why bring flowers to a clandestine meeting by the river after shedding a wedding dress, unless the bouquet was not symbolic merely for its intended recipient, but for the bride herself, a reminder of trust, broken bonds, the need for protection? She had left this behind as a sign, though perhaps without meaning to. Mally squinted. "Sir, does this tell us where she went?" "It tells us she feared being followed," Purbright said quietly. "But it also tells us she was not alone on this path. Whoever met her here was the same person watching her near the boarding house lane." He stood, brushing the mud from his coat. And that watcher, Mally, was not Harbert. He wouldn't risk dirtying his shoes. As they turned back toward town, the inspector lifted his eyes toward the rooftops where a pair of pigeons scattered noisily, but his thoughts were fixed on the widening circle. Harbert had tried too hard to steer suspicion away from something, or someone. The bride, in her quiet desperation, had been moving through the town avoiding particular faces. And now the second basket had appeared with the missing half of the photograph, as though the puppeteer behind this sequence had suddenly lost their grasp on secrecy and was scrambling to regain control. The story had shifted from theatrical presentation to frantic correction, and Purbright knew with a quiet certainty that the next clue would not be left intentionally. It would emerge from the culprit's fear. The fear that their carefully planned narrative was beginning to unravel, just as the truth began to surface beneath it. Inspector Purbright returned from the towpath with the quiet, unhurried steps of a man who had added more questions to an already cluttered shelf of them. The freesia petal, tucked neatly between the pages of his notebook, felt lighter than air, and yet weighted with meaning. He had seen enough human dramas, petty, tragic, and occasionally deranged, to know that those who moved in fear left traces not of panic, but of purpose. The bride's path was purposeful. Each turn she took, each person she avoided, suggested a mind acutely aware of its dangers. Back inside the station, the bustle of mid-morning routine thinned into the familiar hum of paperwork and shoe scuffs. The basket containing the newly found photograph half sat on his desk, its presence faintly irritating, in the same way a poorly tuned radio hummed on the edge of hearing. Purbright closed the door softly and sat in his chair, folding his hands before him. He allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. The difficulty, he reflected, was not the scattered fragments of the case. Those could be gathered, sorted, matched. It was the intention behind the fragments. Someone was trying very hard to create a narrative, not truth, but persuasion, a series of staged events designed to suggest danger, involvement, responsibility. The first basket had appeared at the chapel at precisely the moment rumours about the bride began to stir. The second had appeared only when the town's evolving gossip suggested the police were leaning too heavily toward confusion rather than alarm. The timing was theatrical, yes, but too reactive to be effective. People lied in two ways, Purbright mused. Some lied boldly, planting large dramatic falsehoods that collapsed with the slightest pressure. Others lied in small shapes, tilting truths, rearranging details, counting on the listener's assumptions to fill the gaps. This culprit was of the second type, yet even subtlety could not hide nervousness. The second basket had been tied left-handed. The handkerchief had been folded too hastily, too unevenly. The photograph halves did not align perfectly without firm pressure, as though the tear had been rehearsed but not executed with calm. Someone was losing their nerve. Purbright leaned back, his eyelids half lowered. The robin pin, the supposed symbol meant to drag Harbut into the centre of attention, was too conveniently placed. And Harbut's eagerness to point at Tranter earlier, bordering on desperation, suggested that the counsellor feared the shadow of suspicion lingering anywhere near him. He was hiding something, but not necessarily guilt. People with secrets, Purbright considered, often panicked at the wrong things. A soft knock on his office door broke his reverie. Sergeant Malley entered with cautious steps. "Sir, there's a Mrs. Larch waiting outside. Says she has information." "Does she indeed?" Purbright asked, rising from his chair. "Show her in." Mrs. Larch, tall and narrow as a broom handle, stepped inside with the hesitancy of someone accustomed to being doubted. She clutched a woolen shawl around her shoulders despite the room being perfectly warm. "Inspector," she began, "I didn't think to say anything before because I wasn't sure if it mattered." "Most things matter, Mrs. Larch," Purbright said kindly. "Some only reveal their importance later." She nodded gratefully. "It's about the young woman, the bride. I saw her the night before she appeared at the chapel. She was near the bus stop outside the grocer's. She kept looking over her shoulder." "Was she alone?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Larch hesitated. "Not exactly. A man was across the street. He stayed very still, but she noticed him. She changed direction the moment she did." "Could you describe him?" "Oh, Inspector, I didn't get much of a look, but he wore a flat cap, and he walked with a slight limp." Purbright nodded. Details like these, small and oddly specific, had a way of proving useful. "Thank you, Mrs. Larch. You've helped more than you realize." She left the station with visible relief, as though having unburdened herself of a troublesome secret. When the door closed behind her, Purbright stood for a moment in reflective silence. A limp. That was new. Not Tranter, not Harbert. Someone else entirely, someone who had been lurking on the periphery, neither bold nor foolish enough to appear in any gossip yet, but close enough to track the bride's movements. He crossed the room and gazed out the window where the town stirred under the noon sun. Flaxborough looked harmless, almost quaint, a town that believed it had nothing to hide. Yet beneath its porcelain surface lay a dense web of motives, grudges, and carefully disguised resentments. He thought again of the bride's expression. Relief, not sorrow. Recognition, not heartbreak. She had been preparing for something, not reacting to it. Someone had driven her to this strange display at the chapel. Someone had instructed her on how to behave, where to stand, what to leave behind. But someone else, the watcher, the man with the limp, had been following her independently. Two forces pulling the same figure in opposite directions. And the bride, caught between them, had done the only thing a quiet, frightened person might do: vanish. Purbright returned to his desk and studied the completed photograph. The man's face gave nothing away. It was the sort of face that fit into crowds without being noticed. No distinguishing scars, no crooked features, no expression of menace. Just a man? Perhaps too ordinary, but ordinary men often had the most to hide. Malley knocked again. "Sir, you should see this." He handed Purbright a slip of pink paper, a message taken down by the station's switchboard operator. "Anonymous caller. Said the man in the photograph is not the bride's groom. Said he is someone she fears." No name, no address, no further detail. Purbright folded the message slowly. Anonymous calls arrived for many reasons: cowardice, guilt, or misguided helpfulness. But the timing, again, mattered. The call came only after the second basket was discovered. The caller had been waiting, or watching. "Malley," Purbright said quietly. "Did the operator say whether the caller sounded young or old?" "She thought young, sir, but the voice was strained, could have been disguised." "Or injured," Purbright murmured. He dismissed Malley with a nod, then sat once more, elbows resting lightly on the desk. The case was slipping its earlier shape, reforming itself into something less theatrical and more human. Beneath the staged clues and deliberate misdirection, there lay a quiet desperation, one belonging not to the bride, but to the person orchestrating her movements. Someone had tried to create a story in which a bride was abandoned, in which a man with a robin pin was responsible. The person hoped the town would whisper, the police would follow, and the truth would be buried beneath a tale of scandal. But stories, crafted out of fear, always showed their seams. Purbright closed his eyes. What frightened the bride enough to hide? What frightened the orchestrator enough to stage? And who, limping behind her in shadows, wanted the truth to surface, or to prevent it? The inspector rose, slipping the completed photograph into his coat pocket. The day outside was bright, the kind of brightness that revealed flaws in windows and secrets in people. He stepped into the street with renewed purpose. The truth, he knew, was no longer in the staged clues. It was in the quiet places where frightened people left their unguarded traces. And Flaxborough, for all its pretensions of calm, was full of such places. Inspector Purbright left the station with the completed photograph resting in his pocket like a folded accusation. The afternoon had grown strangely warm for the season, soft light filtering through thin clouds in a way that made Flaxborough look deceptively tranquil. People strolled the pavements with baskets and string bags, gossiping lightly, unaware that beneath their small talk lay the tremors of a much deeper disturbance. For all the town's fondness for speculation, it rarely sensed the truth until it was already halfway through someone else's explanation. Purbright, however, sensed it now, somewhere just beyond clarity, like a lantern glimpsed through fog. He walked toward the council building, a squat brick structure that pretended to be grander than it was through the earnest application of pillars and a polished brass plaque. Inside, a faint smell of furniture polish and aging carpet hung in the air. Councillor Harbert, ever punctual, would be attending the afternoon committee luncheon. Purbright had decided, after much quiet deliberation, that this would be the moment to test him, not with accusation, but with something far more effective, uncertainty. He found Harbert in the hallway, adjusting his tie in the reflection of a framed portrait of a former mayor whose expression suggested lifelong disappointment in civic affairs. The councillor turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, his face brightening with a practiced warmth that never reached his eyes. "Inspector Purbright," he exclaimed. "What a pleasant surprise. Joining us today, are you?" "Only briefly," Purbright said with gentle politeness. "I had a small question before you begin your luncheon." "A question? About the bride incident, I presume?" Harbert's tone carried a flattering mixture of concern and eagerness, yet beneath it Purbright detected the faintest tremor of apprehension. "I wished to ask," Purbright began lightly, "whether you have recently misplaced a lapel pin." Harbert froze, the movement so slight that an untrained observer might have missed it. But Purbright felt the tension ripple beneath the councillor's fixed smile. "A lapel pin?" Harbert repeated too evenly. "No, I don't believe so. Why?" "It is of no great importance," Purbright replied pleasantly. "Only that a robin was found, a small one, perched where one wouldn't ordinarily expect to find it." Harbert blinked rapidly, then forced a laugh. "Ah, well, I've had several lapel pins over the years. They come and go, you know. One hardly keeps track of them." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "Robins are migratory creatures, after all." Harbert opened his mouth, then closed it, unable to determine whether he was being mocked. Purbright offered him an agreeable smile, the sort that politely unsettled people who suspected they were being outmaneuvered. But the inspector had no intention of revealing anything further. He offered a courteous nod and walked past the councillor toward the luncheon room, pausing only long enough to thank the committee secretary before taking in the scene. Several local officials were already seated, exchanging grievances disguised as civic discussion. Purbright noticed that as he entered, Harbert remained in the hallway a moment longer than necessary, as though regaining his composure. The reaction was telling. Too telling. Purbright stayed only a few minutes, long enough to engage in brief, polite conversation, and, more importantly, to observe Harbert in the company of others. The councillor's gestures were animated, his voice controlled, but his eyes flickered toward Purbright with uneasy frequency. Something had been stirred. When Purbright stepped back outside, the afternoon air felt fresher, as though the town itself exhaled. He walked the short distance to the high street, where a line of shops hummed with the slow commerce of late day. He stopped beside Wetherell's bakery to allow a delivery cart to pass. The cart's driver, a young man with earnest eyes and flower on his collar, nodded respectfully as he guided the horse along. At that moment, Purbright spotted something across the street. A man lingering near the tobacconist's doorway, leaning slightly on one leg. A flat cap obscured his forehead. His coat was plain and grey. But the limp, the subtle unevenness in his stance, marked him immediately. The watcher. Purbright did not change his pace or direction. He simply crossed the street as though he had intended to all along, pausing to inspect the window display of the chemist's. In the reflection of the glass, he saw the man shift, turn, and slip into the alley beside the tobacconist's with the hesitant speed of someone neither bold nor entirely confident in their concealment. Interesting. Purbright turned toward the alley, adjusting his coat collar as though preparing merely for a stroll. He entered the narrow passageway quietly, his shoes barely whispering on the stone. The alley curved around the back of the shops, branching into a small courtyard used for deliveries. A pile of crates stood stacked near the wall, giving the place a sense of mild disarray. But no watcher was visible. Purbright stood still, listening. A faint scrape from behind the stack of crates. "Good afternoon," the inspector said conversationally. Silence. "I don't require an introduction," Purbright continued mildly. "Only your cooperation." After a tense moment, the man emerged slowly, eyes darting with defensive calculation. He was younger than expected, early 30s perhaps, with a narrow face and nervous jaw. His limp was slight but unmistakable. "I didn't do anything," the man said, voice tight. "I haven't accused you of anything," Purbright replied. "Though it is curious, you've been observing a woman who seems determined to avoid being seen." The man swallowed hard. "I wasn't following her for myself." "No?" Purbright asked softly. "Then for whom?" The man hesitated, eyes flicking toward the alley mouth. "I shouldn't say." "That often means you should," Purbright said gently. "For your own safety." The man looked at him with something between desperation and suspicion. "You wouldn't understand." "I understand more than most," Purbright said quietly. "I understand fear. And I understand being used." That last word struck the man visibly. His shoulders sagged. "Look," he muttered, "I was supposed to make sure she didn't disappear, that's all. I didn't hurt her, never would." "Who instructed you?" Purbright pressed softly, though his tone carried no threat. The man's lips parted, but before he could speak, a shout echoed from the end of the alley. "Inspector!" Purbright turned as Sergeant Malley hurried toward them, his breath visible in the cooling air. "Sir, there's been another call. Anonymous. Says the bride's in danger and that you're being fed lies." Purbright absorbed this calmly, though the watcher flinched visibly at the words. "We'll continue this later," the inspector said to the man, his voice low. "For now go home, and avoid alleys." The man nodded once, grateful, terrified, and slipped away before Malley reached them. Back on the main road, Purbright walked with the sergeant toward the station. The street bustled again, oblivious to the strained conversation that had just taken place. As they stepped inside, Malley handed the inspector a note, scribbled hastily by the switchboard operator. "You're following the wrong man. The one with the robin is not the one she fears." Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. Someone was indeed growing desperate. The town's quiet routines resumed around the edges of the station, but Purbright felt the shift unmistakably now. The shadows of the case were bending, turning, revealing new shapes. The test he had begun at the luncheon had stirred more than Harbert's composure. It had awakened the ones watching from the edges. He placed the note beside the photograph on his desk. The truth was no longer hiding. It was circling him. Inspector Purbright did not rush the next morning, though his instincts told him that haste was precisely what the culprit hoped for. A rushed mind overlooked details, a calm one connected them. And so he began the day, as he often did, quietly, thoughtfully, allowing the threads of the case to settle in his mind with the unhurried logic of a clock pendulum. The completed photograph lay on his desk, its edges aligned with a precision the culprit had not intended. The robin pin glinted faintly. The anonymous warnings. The watcher with the limp. The bride drifting through Flaxborough like a frightened ghost. The staged baskets, hurriedly assembled clues, false trails meant to mislead. All of these formed a pattern, but it was not the one the culprit had designed. It was the one that betrayal designs when it works faster than a guilty mind can keep up with. Purbright slipped the photograph into his coat pocket, then gestured for Sergeant Malley to follow him. "We are going to the station office," he said, "and we will require privacy." Mally blinked. "Expecting visitors, sir?" "Yes," Purbright replied mildly. "Several." The station office was a small, lamp-lit room overlooking the platform. It had the sort of plain respectability that suited confessions, polite denials, and uncomfortable truths. Purbright chose 2 chairs, one for himself, one positioned deliberately opposite with its back to the window. Anyone sitting there would feel observed without knowing why. He had just settled into place when the first arrival knocked. Councillor Harbert swept in with the agitation of a man who had spent the night inventing justifications. "Inspector, I heard you wish to speak with me privately?" "Indeed," Purbright said. "Do sit." Harbert lowered himself cautiously. "This is about the bride, I presume?" "In part," Purbright replied. "But more specifically about the man in the photograph you were so eager for us not to notice." Harbert's mouth tightened. "I never said—" "No," Purbright interrupted gently. "You implied, and you steered. Toward Mr. Tranter, toward anyone but yourself." Harbert straightened, indignant. "I steer nothing, Inspector." "You attempted to steer everything," Purbright said, "but incompetently." The councillor sputtered, but before he could produce another excuse, a second knock sounded. The watcher entered, cap removed, limp more pronounced now that he no longer tried to disguise it. His eyes flicked between Purbright and Harbert with a mixture of shame and defiance. "You told me to come," he said quietly to the inspector. "And you did," Purbright replied. "Thank you." Harbert stood abruptly. "Inspector, why is this lurker present?" "Because he, unlike you, has told me nothing but the truth," Purbright said. A third knock. The door opened slowly. The bride stepped inside. No dress, no veil, no trembling. She wore a simple grey coat, her hair tied back, her face pale but composed. She glanced briefly at Purbright, then at the watcher, but her gaze avoided Harbert entirely. Her avoidance was more eloquent than accusation. Purbright rose. "Please, sit." She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, with a calmness that came from exhaustion rather than peace. The watcher shifted as though wishing to stand nearer to her, but one look from Purbright kept him still. Harbert swallowed loudly. "Inspector, what is the meaning of this theatre? I have—" Purbright lifted a hand. "Councillor, I will now explain the truth as I understand it. You may correct me if I err, though I do not expect to." Silence settled over the room, taut as a drawn string. "Several days ago," Purbright began, "a young woman arrived in Flaxborough. She was frightened, travelling alone, pursued not by a lover or groom, but by a man connected to a financial fraud that she inadvertently exposed." The bride's eyes dropped. Purbright continued. "She sought help from someone she believed she could trust. That someone was a relative of the watcher here, his older brother, recently deceased, who had served as an accountant for a council-approved charity." Harbert stiffened. "Yes, that charity," Purbright said softly. "The one whose funds were quietly diverted, quite cleverly in fact, until this young woman stumbled onto the irregularities." Harbert's face drained of colour. Purbright went on, voice steady and calm. "She came here because she believed her contact could shelter her, but she found him gone. Instead, she found this man." He nodded toward the watcher. "His brother, who knew nothing of her but understood enough to keep her hidden while he sought advice." "I didn't know what else to do," the watcher murmured. "She said someone dangerous was looking for her." "Indeed," Purbright said softly. "And that someone was you, Councillor." Harbert's outrage reared again, but it was shakier now. "Preposterous!" "Not at all," Purbright replied. You attempted to intercept her. You followed her to the station. You arranged for someone else to watch her when she slipped from your sight." The counsellor's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the bride, confirming the suspicion. "Then," Purbright continued, "you constructed a story, a dramatic one, a bride abandoned, a mysterious groom, baskets with clues, blood for effect, a torn photograph designed to pull attention toward yourself, but only in ways you believed you could control." Harbert's breath shuddered. "You charmingly overestimated your subtlety," Purbright said. The bride finally looked up. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "I never wanted to wear the dress," she said. "He told me it was the only way to make the town see me, to make them help find the dangerous man following me." Harbert's face twisted. "You agreed?" "I was afraid," she whispered. "You said you'd help, but you only watched me, followed me, pressured me." "And when she fled you," Purbright said, "you panicked. You created the second basket to suggest she had been harmed. You wanted the police to believe a violent groom had appeared, or that the watcher was responsible." Harbert shook his head violently. No, this is all. I was trying to protect my reputation. If a word got out about the missing charity funds, my career would collapse," Purbright finished gently. "Yes, I suspected that was your primary concern." The counsellor sank into the chair as though the air had been drained from it. Purbright folded his hands. "Your error, counsellor, was assuming that panic and improvisation could outpace quiet observation. It rarely does." The bride exhaled shakily, relief softening her posture. The watcher stepped slightly closer to her. Harbert sagged in defeat. Purbright spoke with the calm finality of a man concluding a simple household matter, not the unravelling of a carefully staged deception. "You did not intend harm, counsellor, only misdirection. But misdirection, when done without skill, reveals more than it conceals." He turned to Mally, who had stood silently by. "Sergeant, I believe we must escort Councillor Harbert to the station proper. He will be charged with fraud, obstruction, and reckless endangerment." Harbert rose weakly, lips pale. "Inspector, this will ruin me?" Purbright regarded him with polite sympathy. "Yes, Councillor, it will." As Mally led Harbert away, the bride sat trembling, not with fear, but with the collapse of tension held too long. Purbright offered her a steadying glance. "You acted bravely," he said quietly, "though unwisely. But you are safe now." The watcher touched her arm gently. She leaned into the gesture, exhausted. Purbright stepped to the window, the faint hum of the station drifting in from the platform. The truth, now spoken, felt strangely unremarkable in the quiet room. Truth often did. He turned back to them. "Let us finish this matter properly," he said. "And then you both can begin again, somewhere less dramatic than Flaxborough." They nodded, relief mingling with disbelief. Purbright opened the door. The case had nearly been crafted into farce. But in the end, it was only human fear, stitched together with small lies, panicked touches, and the trembling desperation of a man trying to keep his misdeeds from daylight. And daylight, as always, had found him. Flaxborough had a long-standing habit of absorbing scandal the way its river absorbed fallen leaves, slowly, without ripples, until the surface returned to its usual, deceptively calm gleam. And so, in the days after Councillor Harbert's arrest, the town resumed its steady rhythm with admirable, if somewhat performative, composure. Shopkeepers continued polishing their windows, church ladies arranged their flowers, and the Bluebell Cafe served its lukewarm tea with the same dutiful mediocrity as always. Yet beneath this veneer of normality, Something restless lingered, like a whisper caught in the rafters. Purbright felt it each time he walked through the high street. People paused their conversations precisely 2 seconds too late, their faces rearranging into expressions of polite innocence. He was accustomed to this. It was less a reaction to him and more to the story that had just unfolded. A bride in the rain, staged clues, an anxious accountant's witness, a councilman's unraveling. The town was quietly savouring every drop of drama, distilling it into anecdote and speculation, each version drifting further from the truth. He did not mind. Truth rarely belonged to the crowd anyway. The paperwork, however, was entirely his. By midweek, his desk resembled the aftermath of a paper avalanche. Statements from witnesses, formal charges against Harbert, letters requesting clarification about the misuse of charity funds, forms signed, countersigned, filed, duplicated, redistributed, misplaced, and found again. Purbright worked through them with his characteristic patience, though each signature felt like a small concession to drudgery. Sergeant Malley appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of tea, the station's attempt at morale. "Sir," he said, placing one mug with solemn care on the inspector's desk, "Mrs. Crampton says she's relieved the business is settled, though she insists the bride's gown was real lace and ought to be preserved for posterity." Purbright smiled faintly. Mrs. Crampton's understanding of posterity is as elastic as her rent policies. Malley grinned. "Shall I respond politely?" "That would be safest," Purbright said, "and tell her the gown is being held as evidence. If she presses further, mention mildew." Malley nodded and left, leaving Purbright alone with the muted tapping of rain against the station windows. It had begun raining again, not with the dramatic melancholy of the bride's vigil, but with a quiet persistence that suited paperwork far too well. Purbright sipped his tea, allowing the mild warmth to settle through him as he considered the case's delicate conclusion. Harbert had confessed, reluctantly, indignantly, but thoroughly, once confronted with the full sequence of events. His misappropriation of charity funds had begun as small adjustments he had told himself he would later correct. But, like most small crimes, it had grown, tangling itself into other deceptions until he could no longer extricate his conscience from his ambitions. The bride, whose real name had been withheld from public gossip by Purbright's quiet intervention, had stumbled upon the irregularities while assisting with bookkeeping. She had confronted Harbert, expecting denial or explanation. Instead, he had panicked, and panic had grown into spectacle. She was now safely relocated outside Flaxborough, assisted discreetly by the watcher, whose true loyalty, Purbright now understood, had been not to Harbert, but to the memory of his brother. The brother had once worked alongside Harbert, unaware of the councillor's thefts, and the watcher had feared that helping the bride would court danger. His fear was well-founded. Harbert's desperation had sharpened into frantic creativity, which produced the bridal ruse, the staged clues, the lurking presence around the chapel. A ridiculous set of theatrics built by a man who had mistaken panic for strategy. Purbright leaned back in his chair. That was the quiet tragedy of the case. Not the money stolen or the false alarms, but the small human failings that had spiraled into something absurd. Harbert had not been evil, merely small, frightened, and unaccustomed to consequences. A soft knock drew Purbright's attention. The watcher stepped into the doorway, cap in hand, standing with the same nervous humility as before. He looked thinner, more tired, as though the previous week's strain had finally caught up to him. "Inspector," he said, "I just wanted to thank you for not assuming the worst." Purbright gestured for him to enter. "You acted with good intentions, though not always wisely. "I know," the man said quietly, "but I didn't want her hurt." "She wasn't," Purbright replied gently. "And your presence helped more than she realizes." The watcher looked relieved, though still uneasy. "Is she all right?" "She is," Purbright said. "She has left town. A friend of her late employer has found a place for her, somewhere quieter." A faint smile crossed the watcher's face. "Good, she deserves that." Purbright nodded. "As do you. I suggest you find steadier employment. Something dull. Dullness is often safer than drama." The watcher chuckled weakly. "Yes, sir." When he left, Purbright sat again, feeling the subtle shift of a case fully closed. The station's silence returned, warm and familiar. The rain's rhythm softened. Later that afternoon, he stepped outside for a short walk. The town looked as it always had, unremarkable, modest, faintly amused with itself. Wetherell's bakery displayed its usual buns. The Bluebell Cafe offered its usual overheard chatter. And outside the chapel where the bride had once stood in the rain, the pavement was dry, the steps clean, the scene utterly ordinary. It was difficult, Purbright thought, for the town to imagine that only days earlier its peace had been disrupted by something quiet, yet profound. He approached the chapel steps, pausing where the wicker basket had once rested. A simple place, unremarkable. And yet for a moment in time it had held a strange gravity, one born not of violence or spectacle, but of human fear pressed into theatrical shape. Purbright stood there a moment longer before returning to the station. More forms awaited him, more tidy summaries for magistrates who preferred their mysteries neatly labelled. But he walked with an ease that came only after the truth had settled into place. Inside, Malley looked up from his desk. "All finished out there, sir?" "For now," Purbright said, removing his coat. "Flaxborough seems intent on resuming its usual tranquility." Malley snorted. "Give it a day," Purbright smiled. "At most?" He sat, lifted his pen and resumed the steady work of finalizing reports. Outside the window, the rain slowed to a fine mist. The town hummed in that familiar, persistent way, content, oblivious, waiting quietly for the next peculiar ripple that would certainly come eventually. And Purbright, calm as ever, settled once more into the gentle rhythms of paperwork, patient in the knowledge that Flaxborough's true constancy was its inexhaustible ability to surprise.